Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Rethinking Value for Money or Best Value in Government Procurement. Today's program is co-hosted by the GW Law Government Procurement Law Program and the National Contract Management Association's Sustainable Procurement Community of Practice. My name is Jessica Tillotman, and I am the Associate Dean for Government Procurement Law at GW Law School. Today's webinar addresses an important, complex, and time-sensitive issue relating to the role of sustainability in government acquisitions. As the effects of climate change become more common, the need for governments to take action has become increasingly urgent. Government procurement systems around the world will play an important role in adapting to and mitigating the effects of climate change through sustainable procurement. Our program today addresses how stakeholders must increasingly consider sustainability in their acquisition processes and will need to reimagine the concept of value for money or best value. In other words, how do we factor into our procurement decisions the social and life cycle costs of most countries' continued reliance on solutions that negatively impact the climate, quality of life, national security, and global stability? It is very clear that the global acquisition community increasingly understands the importance of this issue in our field, given that we have representatives joining us today from 65 different countries and from a multitude of diverse organizations representing governments at the national and subnational levels, industry, academia, and NGOs. We are thrilled to have an all-star lineup of experts joining us today to discuss these important issues. Professor Roberto Caranta, Holly Hall, Professor Nicole Darnall, and Senior Associate Dean and Professor Steve Schooner. We hope that today's program will lead to further collaboration, including the sharing of knowledge and best practices among this growing global community of practice. Throughout this session, I will be sharing links to the resources discussed during the program, and we welcome your questions throughout the program by using Zoom's Q&A function. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to my friend and colleague, Professor Steve Schooner. Steve, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Jessica, and thanks everybody for joining us. I am absolutely ecstatic to be part of this discussion. What I want to do first is further introduce our colleagues today. And what I feel like I'm doing is introducing you to some of the leading voices in the field, but I do want to set the stage for the breadth of experience that we've brought together today. I'm assuming if you took the time out of your day to participate in this webinar, you're familiar with at least one or two of us, but I'm guessing that not that many of you have crossed paths with all three of us. So if my introductions are a bit quirky, so be it, but we'll be sharing more fulsome biographies in the chat. And of course, none of us should be relatively new to most of you. I want to start with Nicole Darnall, who, for my money, is the leading sustainable procurement scholar or academic in the United States. And one of the things that I really appreciate about working with Nicole is the reminder, not just in this country, but abroad, two things. First, public procurement is much more than just a federal game. The state and local market in many ways is larger than the federal market, even if we who are experts in federal procurement think that we invented everything and we control the world. Similarly, and this is so important and I can't emphasize it enough, the private sector in many ways is well ahead of what's happening in public procurement today. And what the private sector does with their supply chain management and procurement is in many ways potentially informative of everything that we do. Some of you may also know that Nicole is basically the leading voice and in many ways the face of Arizona State University's Sustainable Procurement Research Institute, which is a terrific resource, which has all kinds of really interesting resources that you should pay attention to. I also think that she's probably the most knowledgeable and sophisticated voice on the United States General Services Administration's Federal Advisory Committee looking at these issues today. And frankly, she's an absolute force of nature. So I'm ecstatic she's with us. I next want to turn to Holly Hall. So closer to me here in Washington, D.C., Holly is one of the procurement leaders at our Department of Homeland Security. And for those of you outside the United States, the Department of Homeland Security is interesting for many reasons. In the history of this country, it's a relatively new and concatenated agency, but they're an agency whose mission will very much and increasingly be impacted by climate change. Now, that will probably be much more under the umbrella of what we would call adaptation rather than mitigation, but they are going to be living climate change in ways that other agencies won't have to deal with as quickly. But I also want to emphasize that Polly has taken on the incredibly important and meaningful role in leading the NCMA, National Contract Management Association, Community of Practice, or COP, the Community of Practice in Sustainable Procurement. Frankly, many of us think that for procurement professionals in the United States, we're behind the curve. But Polly is helping push us forward. Among other things, we now have a monthly column in Contract Management Magazine, and you'll start to see more of those coming out soon. We'll talk more about the Community of Practice later. But the other reason that it's great to have Polly here is she's someone who is not just talking the talk, she's not only walking the walk, but learning to drag others along. So she's someone who's very much focused on being a change agent. Now, turning across the pond, let me turn to Professor Roberto Caranta, who is normally, most of the time, at the University of Turin, or should we say Torino. And if you've never visited the north of Italy, I encourage you to go, particularly if you're a foodie, because it's the mothership for Italy, but we can talk about that another day. I did have to laugh in preparing for this webinar because in a recent seminar, I heard a mutual colleague of ours make a reference to the generation of senior colleagues in the field. And I might say that I was a little taken aback, but I can say that with regard to Roberto, this is a good example of where seniority reflects expertise and wisdom. As some of you may know, Roberto's recently co-edited book with William Jansen, Mandatory Sustainability Requirements in EU Public Procurement Law, is making the rounds. And even for American readers, I can't recommend the book enough because it shows you how totally different the conversation is in the European Union than it is here in the United States. Another important role that Robert plays is he and his university, his colleagues, are actively involved in what we refer to as the Sapiens Network. This is a remarkable thing, particularly for Americans. The European Union funded a collaboration that includes 9 fully funded PhD students who were embarked on an extraordinary endeavor to change the way we think, study, and talk about these issues. I also want to thank him because it was not so many years ago at a small program in New York City that Nicole was also at, he began to shake me out of my complacency because at the time I had fallen into the trap of firmly believing that United States federal procurement was incapable of engaging in the kinds of changes we're going to be talking about today. So I'm a little bit more optimistic in part because of him. So let's go ahead and get started. We're here today, and one of the things that we want to talk about is how we think and talk about best value or value for money in procurement. Now, the Americans will remember in the 1990s, it was all the rage during the procurement reform movement to talk about the phrase best value, while the rest of the world, unbeknownst to most Americans, was working with the term value for money. But these terms were intended at the time to distinguish the baseline or the instinct or the general approach of focusing on low purchase prices. Because as you know, consumers buy almost nothing in the world where the only thing they care about is the lowest price. They focus on value. Now, the European Union soon went off on their expedition with interesting terms like meet for the most economically advantageous tender. And of course, there are other things that we've talked about with regard to the cost technical trade-off. But this is really important as we think about the evolving landscape in sustainable procurement. Now, one of the reasons that we think this conversation is so important is for many, particularly American policymakers, legislators, and senior procurement officials, We often hear the reaction that sustainability or sustainable procurement is just another constraint. It's just another social policy. And what that suggests is it's not terribly important. Now, I want to be clear, we don't have time today, and it's not our purpose. So this isn't the forum to persuade you that climate change is the most significant challenge faced by us broadly ever. And if you want to, I'm more than willing to recommend more reading on that, and not just from the IPCC and the National Climate Assessment. But in the United States, we have a pretty long history of social and redistributive policies being integrated into our procurement system. Maybe a little bit less so in other countries, but we have a history with small business, disadvantaged business, women-owned business, service-disabled veterans. We focused on areas of high unemployment, now with what we refer to as hub zones. We focused on labor policies. But I hope one of the things that you'll take away from this is that I shouldn't be alone, and I know I'm not alone, in concluding that when we talk about sustainable procurement, we're not doing the same thing. What we want to focus more on is we're thinking not only about how we buy, but what we buy. Or more importantly, we're much more focused on the outcomes of the procurement. And sometimes that means what we buy, but it also is much less about who we're buying from as opposed to what we're buying and what that means to us as consumers. So I apologize for the long-winded introduction, but now I'm going to go around the horn real quickly, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists in turn how they might define value or how they want procurement professionals to think about the concept of value in 2024 in the context of sustainable procurement. So let me go ahead and start with Nicole.
Sure. Thank you, Steve. Thank you also for the very humbling introduction. It's fantastic to be here with such a great panel of individuals. So for me, price rarely accounts for the full cost of production and disposal when it comes to goods and services, rarely. So if this is your primary focal point, you're ignoring the negative social impacts associated with those purchases and the environmental harms that come with it. So when we talk about value for money procurement, this is an approach that more accurately assesses the true cost of those goods and services, while simultaneously contributing to social benefits, such as the promotion of gender equality and women's empowerment, but thinking about all of this across the entire supply chain, because whatever's purchased at the end of that decision-making process embodies all of the environmental ills that come with it and all of the decision-making that occurred within that supply chain. So it is a much broader concept when we think about value for money procurement.
Roberto?
I join in thanking for the kind words and the invitation. Well, I think that the problem is a little bit too little history. This thing about lowest price, best value, has not always been around. Procurement has always been about achieving other goals. There is a 1972 book by Colin Tarpin, and he's saying, okay, beside very small purchases, all procurement is about something different that we would call societal value. And this is very clear. Then we had the revolution, but the revolution in procurement was a kind of opening a new, very specific theme that was also politically motivated. I would compare this to Milton Friedman's words about the social responsibility of companies. Oh, it's just about making profit. And so the state should just save money. But this is incredibly short-sighted. you might save money by buying something that then is difficult to dispose or pollutes a lot, and then you have to spend money to redress environmental and social harm. So I think best value today has to do with achieving a maximization of utilities for both the purchaser and the wider society. Because the one that is buying here is the state, and the state has a lot of responsibilities. And this, I must say, in Europe was already clear with an old 2000 case, Concordia Bus, where the Court of Justice said most economically advantageous standard doesn't mean just economic in a narrow sense. It might as well include environmental aspects that today we would say climate-related environmental aspects.
There's so much I love about these answers, and I'll get to Polly in just 1 second, but I really want to pause for a moment and just let's reflect on the fact that when we talk about public procurement, the state as a buyer is different than you and me as individual consumers. And if there's any institution with buying authority anywhere that should care about the externalities associated with climate change, it has to be the state, right? So if the storms get worse and the water rises and the fires get more dramatic, and if there's famine and drought, which leads to migration and regional instability, these are things that the state is going to have to address and pay for. So these are very much real risks to the state that many of us as consumers just don't think about the same way. So I really appreciate that focus on value in terms of the government consumer as they think about procurement. Okay, Polly. You're still muted.
I'm not anymore. No, building off of that, I just want to likewise thank you for having me on the panel and really look forward to this time with all of our audience members today. Building off of that total cost of ownership that Nicole touches upon, and that federal lens, right? The country lens that you just brought forward from Roberto's discussion of this topic. It really, to me, is thinking about that best value continuum that we have as we consider our federal procurement decisions, and recognizing that all along we have brought in social priorities into our procurement process, right? There are clauses in federal contracts today that get after many significant social harms that we want to make sure we are considering when we do business with the private sector, be it human trafficking, be it labor practices. So for us not to give value consideration to the criticality of harms that climate change presents to us as a both country, but also as a global community of partners, I think is doing a great disservice. And so, to me, it's really helping our federal acquisition community as we think about best value, think about not just that initial purchase price, but operating costs, efficiency, the longevity of the materials and goods that we procure, and then what happens to them post life, right? Like the disposal pieces of it. I think only if we start thinking about all of those, used to be considered externalities as part of our true costs, not just at our own level, but as Nicole said, down the supply chain, what our contractors are doing as we do business with them and how they are operating are also fair play for consideration in federal procurement as we really think about how to best get after this really critical and important requirement. I look at this as investments in our future. Let me just put it that way. And we have a big role to play. It's just, how do we best support our federal community and our industry partners in building these bridges rapidly?
Well, I like so much about that, but I also think that based on what each of you said, I just want to double back for a second, because implicit in so much of what each of you said is that we need to talk. And again, I think vocabulary is really an important part of us moving up the learning curve on this. But one of the things, if you think about the various terms that a lot of us were just using, much of this is captured in the global discussion these days under the umbrella or the rubric of LCT, what sometimes we call life cycle thinking. Sometimes it's described as LCCA, life cycle cost analysis. Some people call it TOC or TCO, total cost of ownership, total ownership cost. But what it's doing is basically giving us an economic tool to reduce, to some extent, to a mathematical formula, thinking about what we're buying and its value by not focusing on the purchase price alone. So in an introductory economics course, we might say that life cycle cost analysis takes the purchase price, but we also add in the operating costs and the maintenance costs over the life of its usage. We might also include, for example, the disposition cost. We might also include the time value of money. But in this context, we're also going to include the potential externalities or the harms or the avoidance of harm. So we think about pricing very differently. The interesting thing in the United States is most highly credentialed procurement professionals have studied life cycle cost analysis and total cost of ownership, but they've never really been asked to do it. So I am kind of curious because, for those of you who are familiar with it, there's an international standard on sustainable procurement, and they talk about life cycle cost as a best practice. So I just briefly, if everybody has some brief comments on how we think we are making progress or not making progress, or we can make more progress with regard to life cycle costs in terms of how our systems work. Can I start with you, Roberto?
Thank you. Well, first I would to address a remark in the chat saying, okay, sustainability is fine, but why public procurement? And the answer, I think, is very, very easy. Public procurement is a lot of money. It's 14% of the EU GDP, and I think similar in many developed countries. We have a really immediate big urgency with climate change. We can't be picky. We really need to have all hands on deck. And it's not going to be easy. You need to develop, we had a book with Bart Andov on life cycle costing. The problem there is methodologies. You need to develop reliable methodologies. But the good news is that methodologies are being developed. You just need to spread the word, take up, improve them. And these methodologies are going to become even more important and easier to use because it's not just the public sector. The private sector is starting to use them because they want to show that they are green, that they are sustainable. And probably in Europe, this will have a big push from another piece of legislation that is about green claims. You can't falsely claim that your product is green, meaning that you needed to have a sound methodology to be ready to prove that indeed you are saving on carbon, you are saving on loss of biodiversity, you name it. So I really think, yes, it was difficult, but it is becoming increasingly easy because methodologies are being developed. Methodologies are already there. You need to check what is already in the market. We had a very nice case, I think, from Denmark, where, okay, a big construction authority was thinking, oh, we might maybe start using recycled asphalt. And they went to talk to the market, and the market was just saying, oh, we were just waiting for you to ask. We are ready. So talk with the market, check what is already available. Thank you.
Nicole?
Sorry, trying to get off mute there. I'm encouraged. I feel that the world is catching on to the fact that purchase price is a ridiculously myopic view of cost. People are asking what happens when a product is disposed, what's happening during its use, what's happening during its production. And cities are managing huge pollution problems because of product use concerns and end-of-life problems, and cities have to clean those up. We're seeing that across states, we're seeing that in the federal government. To Roberto's point, the methodologies have advanced significantly. If you pay attention to the chat, Martha Anvalf has pointed out that the legal setting is also paying attention and catching up. When you partner these two things together, the legal setting with strong methodologies, then we have a recipe to actually manage the situation.
Polly?
Yeah, the ability to consider the costs across the life cycle, right? Total cost of ownership is going to be really important for our federal community to get our arms around. And, there are great models and methodologies out there to lean into. To me, this goes beyond the role of a contracting officer and gets to how we're bringing that experience, competency to the acquisition community broader, meaning how are we partnering with our economists, with our financial officers, with our environmental experts to build that understanding. And then, to Roberto's very important point, how are we working with the market to validate, right? Against standards that we know are reliable and have proven themselves out over time. And so there's a lot of work to do in this area. And I'm not going to pretend that at the federal level, we've been great at it so far, but there are good use cases to build from.
So I'm going to apologize. I kind of had a more thematic approach intended on this, but given what we've just talked about, I want to jump to a more specific issue, and then maybe we'll come back to the more general in a moment. But I want to focus, I just want to focus for a moment on this concept of competencies and abilities and thinking about what all this means to the workforce. And as we think about building capacity, and there's a lot of capacity building that's going to be required here, one of my new favorite phrases, and I'm attributing it to Marta Anvalf, who's now active in the chat here, but you'll also see it repeatedly in Roberto and William Jensen's book, is the need for procurement professionals to achieve basic carbon literacy. I just want you to internalize that phrase for a moment. Basic carbon literacy. If you're a DAWIA level 3, if you're FACC certified, for the average public procurement professional, basic carbon literacy, wow, what does that mean? Well, to my mind, it means the procurement professionals are increasingly going to be asked or are going to be required to do a number of things increasingly. First, they're going to need to, at some level, appreciate or internalize the need to reduce emissions. Or in other words, public procurement professionals are going to need to get out of their own heads and say, one of the things that the government does, the goal of government is to enhance quality of life. This is really important. I need to think about this, as Robert says, all hands on deck in every procurement activity I take. Then the next big step is they're going to have to, at some level, be familiar with how we talk about, how we measure, how we disclose and how we target reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, or GHGs. So people are going to need to be familiar with the greenhouse gas protocols, which is not a United States unique concept. They're going to need to be familiar with the difference between scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, direct, indirect, and supply chain. I'm overgeneralizing, but this is pretty complicated stuff. And then they're going to need to know how to weigh that information, not only conceptually, but potentially as an evaluation factor, or maybe only as a responsibility criteria under the FAR proposed rule in the United States. But going back to where we were a moment ago, frankly, it may be something that we're going to use to internalize our externalities through life cycle cost analysis. So my question to each of you, and you can take it any way you want, but how are we going to instill basic carbon literacy in our workforce, and what else do we need to do in terms of building capacity? So on this one, let me go ahead and start with Polly, and then we'll go around. Go ahead.
Yeah, and in this one, I'm putting on my chair of the Sustainable Procurement Community of Practice with NCMA, our National Contract Management Association. I think there is an important responsibility for NCMA to think about as owners of our contract management standard and our contract management book of knowledge, right? Our credentials, to really consider how to build this competency into the learning development of our workforce. So part of what the Sustainable Procurement Community of Practice is doing is partnering there with NCMA and stakeholders to think about how to best incorporate that competency in. And there's some important work we have to do there, along with, right, because the Federal Acquisition Institute and the Defense Acquisition University and their federal credentials for contract management professionals have aligned the credentials with the NCMA contract management standards, is to make sure that learning and that competency requirement builds out into our professional credentialing or certification and credentialing process at the federal level. So to me, this is a critical competency. And as you said, Steve, right, this has to become part of how we do the business of buying. And so how do we bring that to bear? It's got to start with what our learning is. And then to me, it goes beyond classroom training. We have to have exposure to help change the way we do business through experiential learning as well. And that means folks with the competency, right seating, left seating with teams as they work this for the first time. As my former hat of driving procurement innovation through our DHS Procurement Innovation Lab taught me, to me, this is a transformative, innovative approach. Like, this is new learning for our community. It's going to require change management across the entire acquisition team. And we can't take this as just another class, right? This is not just another class. This is an entirely new fundamental way of doing business across the board.
Yeah, there's so much I like about that, but I think I'm going to turn to Nicole in just 1 second. But I am reminded that, and again, I don't mean to basically channel Nicole, but one of the things that we often talk about here is the biggest mistake you can make in sustainable procurement is going alone. None of us need to reinvent the wheel here. One of the advantages of bringing together the global community here is there are best practices from around the world. Countries are out there experimenting with everything. So just because you haven't done it in your office or your agency or your state or whatever, there are so many good resources. And in a moment, we'll drop a link in for the big global study from 2022 on best practices. Maybe Nicole will say a word on that, but we'll come back to these issues. But let me go ahead and turn it over to Nicole. Oh, sure.
Let me just reiterate, we don't have time to reinvent the wheel, right? So we have to learn from folks that are ahead of the curve here.
And why would you want to? Why would you want to go through all of the pain that another organization has already sifted through? We should be taking inspiration from that and moving forward. So much of what you said, Polly, resonates with me, especially the change management focal point. Within some of the work that we've been doing within the GSA's acquisition workforce subcommittee that I work with on the GAPFAC, relates to this issue of change management. And the ideas that we've been moving forward there focus on this notion that at the point of recruitment, individuals need training. From the moment they get in the door, they need to be socialized into why this is important. The second thing that you mentioned that really resonates with me is this FACT-C process, the certification process, and the modernization process that's moving forward now. This is where individuals get professional development training. It's not a one and done. It's constant. You're constantly going through this. This is where we have an opportunity to develop sustainability specialists within the federal acquisition process and a sustainability credential at the highest level where individuals become recognized as specialists. We also need to pay attention to the fact that our knowledge isn't stationary. We're learning more about our climate problem constantly. And so as part of the training, we need to adapt and incorporate that new knowledge. So it's not stagnant. One of the other issues that's part of this is data. We need data to inform the decisions moving forward. This is going to require integration with current procurement systems. It's going to require standardization across data, because at present, the data are in different places, but they're not talking to each other. And if what we hope to do ultimately is reward the workforce for making the decisions and moving down the pathway that we hope that we're going to go to address the climate crisis, we have to really have really good data to back that up. So I want to pause because Steve mentioned a study that I was affiliated with. Within the Sustainable Purchasing Research Initiative, or SPRI, we have taken a comparative perspective to look at the top facilitators for sustainable procurement success. And we've studied with partners across the US, Japan, Australia, Italy, Mexico, South Korea, and Spain. So, just a handful of countries here. 4,000 municipalities to ask, what are the determinants to sustainable procurement success? And there were 5, ironically or surprisingly, I mean, these are very, very diverse settings. We saw the same 5 items pop up across every one of these countries. The first, and mind you, this is at the municipal level. So the first is to build on existing complementary policies and practices, build on what you already have. Most municipalities have some sort of a pollution prevention program in place that's getting bubbled up possibly into an energy conservation policy or a waste reduction policy. Sustainable procurement is the next step to that, and to rely on the talent that's there and build it out further. The second area I've mentioned briefly, and Holly talked about as well, this issue of information access. This is vital. How do acquisition professionals know what to purchase? If green is what matters, if climate friendly is what matters, how do you determine what's climate friendly? And what that means is access to data, and we need systems that are integrated with one another to help guide individuals to the right decisions. Now, the beauty is we have amazing estimation capabilities that are out there right now. What I fear is that this becomes the log jam to making progress. And don't let perfect get in the way of good. We have to start with good. The third area that we've noticed is the role of top-level support and leadership. It's not enough to have the boots on the ground saying that this is an important issue. Leaders, it's time to step up and lead. This is vital for the well-being of our planet moving forward. It's important for individuals across the organization to hear about why this matters, and don't believe that this is a one and done. It is impossible to over-communicate the importance of an issue when you're trying to create change and cultural change. The last two items that we found across all settings, all countries, innovation culture. So individuals need to have permission to experiment and fail. They need to have discretion to pilot test, to learn along the way. At the municipal level, cities are doing this by way of competitions across departments. They're making this fun. They're thinking critically about high-level, high-profile awards and recognitions for individuals who are willing to take a chance and try new things. The last area relates to collaboration. So Steve mentioned this before. I'll come back to this later too. You don't go it alone. You draw on the networks and the connections that you have in place now, and vendors are a wealth of information. This gets back to the information access question. And while I understand that we have restrictions for how we engage with vendors, that it's important that we keep arm's length distances with vendors at particular times within the procurement process. It's important to recognize that once we attend to those boundaries, there's a lot that we can do within them to collaborate and acquire information, and vendors are essential allies within this process.
So much good content there. I want to just capture it all. So we're going to come back to some of these things. But before I go back to Roberto, I just want to remind you of three things that you definitely heard, but you'll keep hearing thematically from all of us. So much of what we do here is change management 101. And change management doesn't happen with a law, and it doesn't happen with a regulation, and it doesn't happen with a policy document. Change management is hard work, and it takes a long time. And in everything you've ever read about change management, leadership, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, and the strength of that communication, the importance of the messaging. And this is why it's so important. What's so hard about some of these issues is convincing people to care about things that they're unfamiliar with or they haven't thought about. And whether that's environmental justice or distributive justice, I mean, for many of us, it's easy to say, don't you care about the world that your kids are going to live in or your kids' kids? That's the easy thing. But the idea that we're in a relatively good place, right? Environmental justice is about the folks that have benefited the most from how we got here are the ones best positioned to ride out the storm to some extent. But again, these issues of change management, leadership, and communication are incredibly important. I wanted to go back to Roberto. Go ahead.
Thank you, Steve, and everyone. Well, both Paul and Nicole, they have really highlighted the important points. So I will just focus a moment on communication. And what we are doing in Europe is really working a lot on this. And these both, if you want, top-down and bottom-up. Top-down, the European Commission, they have a wonderful website on sustainable public procurement with case studies updated every month, with experiences, with model clauses. And they have other initiatives. Now they have a big buyer initiative. And this big buyer initiative means putting together buyers in given sectors like solar panel, construction, working together to develop new standards, new clauses, new approaches. And this is very, very important. And thank you for mentioning Sapiens. This is the idea again. Europe is ready to put money into research in these areas. And we are developing a number of studies, but also more practical instruments. On our website, there is the wonderful course by Marta Andov on sustainable public procurement law, open access for everyone. But it's not just top-down pushed by the Commission. It's also bottom-down. Bottom-up. Is ICLEI is an organization of local government, and ICLEI works a lot on sustainable public procurement. And these other projects about, for instance, food procurement in schools. It's a lot of initiatives. Well, they might always be better coordinated, but I totally buy Nicole's argument line. Well, better is always tomorrow. Let's do good today. Thank you a lot.
So I want to turn back to Polly because, again, I know that we have folks from around the world, but here in the United States, there's a fair amount of resistance to paying any price premium for a more sustainable product or a service. And what's frustrating about that is there's an instinct to say that you can't, but it's not necessarily true. So, Polly, how do we convince procurement professionals as they start to embrace this concept of value that it is okay for them to think more holistically about what matters to government consumers?
Well, I think first of all, there's sometimes this premise that, oh, sustainability is new and we haven't considered it before, but pieces of this, right, albeit not total cost of ownership necessarily, but pieces of it have been in our regulations for decades, right? We have FAR Part 23, undergoing maybe not enough of, but at least a much needed phased rewrite right now with the housekeeping FAR rule change is a piece of the puzzle. But more importantly, I think it's really important to recognize that consideration of the cost of climate change, right? Paying that value premium for a more sustainable outcome, right? Beyond the product or service, right? The partners and their goals as you think upstream, right? And start to get after scope 2 and 3 emissions is absolutely permissible in our current 2-day federal acquisition regulatory framework. And I've done a lot of this kind of proliferation under the innovation lens. It's the same piece of the guiding principles of the FAR that I'm championing and articulating as we think about change management around sustainability. Our FAR Part 1 guiding principles explicitly tells the acquisition team that in exercising their initiative, members of that team can assume that if a specific strategy, practice, policy, or procedure is in the best interest of the government and is not addressed in the FAR nor prohibited by law, right, that it is absolutely a permissible exercise of authority. And I think, to me, as I help teams overcome the fear or resistance or concern, that's one of the pieces I guide them to. And I would argue that nowhere in the FAR are we prohibited from considering this today. It's how we are doing that aligned to our requirement and obviously within our budgets, which becomes part of the challenge here, but aligned to our requirements and what our objectives are. And we have a lot of discretion in how we shape that.
And I think that's a beautiful transition. I'm going to turn back to Nicole. Can we just talk about the business case now? I mean, it's one thing for us to talk about, we can say value for money, but what is the business case for doing what we're doing?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this. And the business case is huge. I'll focus on 5 items. The first is that it connects with the public organization's strategic mission. And what makes this important is what we're talking about is shifting procurement from a purely tactical approach within the organization to creating a pathway for it to achieve the organization's broader strategic mission. This relates to serving, to providing social benefits more broadly to our community. So that's the first item. The second is that procurement work is in crisis. Let's be clear. It's not just within the United States. We're seeing this across the globe, that it's top heavy. Workers are retiring and we're not replacing people at the same pace. The argument, when we think about value for money, the argument against it is that it increases complexity. Oh, this is too hard. So it makes it difficult for an already shrinking working force. The irony is that value for money procurement actually facilitates recruitment and retention. It's the opposite from the mantra that's coming forward, that the new generation wants to connect with something bigger than just undertaking a tactical job. The idea that they may be improving society along the way is a huge motivator to consider work that they otherwise might not. What we know is that across the board, public sector, private sector, purpose-driven work is what brings people in the door, and that's what keeps people in the door. It also enhances the organization's overall brand perception as well. So that's number 2. Number 3 for the business case is that it increases an organization's ability to manage and mitigate risk. Now, this may not be entirely obvious, but it enhances supply chain resilience. And we're seeing this both in the public sector and the private sector, that diverse suppliers is what's needed when you're thinking about sustainable procurement, different sorts of suppliers. A lot of smaller businesses come into this space. And these diverse suppliers lead to better, cheaper, faster procurement. You create a more lively marketplace for contractors within this space. The statistics are showing about 19% more value is created to organizations that diversify their supplier base in this way. It's also a cost reduction strategy when we talk about risk mitigation. So you're avoiding the financial risk associated with volatile raw material prices and supply chain disruptions and the like. One of the nuggets of information that we collected during this time came about when during COVID, that in the work that I did for the United Nations as part of the 2022 Global Review, is that we found when we surveyed different organizations, 2/3 of the organizations that had implemented sustainable procurement reported either no effect on during COVID on the implementation of their sustainable procurement activities, or actually an increase in sustainable procurement. 25% say that they increase their sustainable procurement, in part because they had developed supply chains that were far more resilient. They had diversified. And so it helped them weather the supply chain crisis that many organizations could not. Number 4 is that we're increasing efficiency opportunities within the organization. And I'll just give a couple of anecdotes here. Within the city of Phoenix, they replaced 100,000 of their street lights. That led to, towards LED-based lights, it led to $22 million worth of savings. So these things are not juxtaposed, sustainability or cost savings. No, they can be compatible. On the social side, the World Economic Forum, they estimate that organizations that embrace ethical supply chain practices cut their overall supply chain costs by 16%. And then the final thing, we've already talked about it before, so I'm just going to end it very briefly, is that we're reducing our life cycle costs, right? And all of the affiliated costs that come with that, that somehow oddly are decoupled from product price. So the business case is strong.
So I think that's really, really helpful. And I like the rubric, and I realize there's only 5, and I'm sure there's more, but they were 5 pretty good ones. But I want to go back to Roberto. And again, I realize that for those of you who are outside the country, this may seem more familiar, but I'd really like to take a moment, particularly for the Americans, if you could talk a little bit about how so much of how the thinking in the EU has evolved to focus not just on this is going to be a different way of how we buy, but what we buy. And I think one of the things that was interesting that jumped out at me in the book is the focus on how the European Union was very, very concerned initially about staying away from focusing on who you buy from. And a lot of that had to do with free trade between the states. You know, in the United States, we would use responsibility and things like that. But we think the qualification is important, but not the same kind of issue that you all did there. But I really think it's important to focus on how sustainable procurement drove the discussion, as we might say, more in terms of specifications and minimum standards and evaluation factors, but this concept of not just how we buy, but what we buy. So some thoughts on that?
Thank you. Well, let's be honest, Europe is very much about fair competition. And honestly, you might have a short-term saving by buying from a dishonest supplier. A supplier not paying taxes, not paying social contribution, polluting. But again, you are the state. You are saving on something you are buying and you are losing tax revenues. You are saving on what you are buying and then you are left with environmental cleanup costs. It doesn't make any sense. You can't have a silos mentality and thinking, oh, but procurement is just separate from everything else a state, a public organization is doing. So this movement that it is starting now with the deforestation regulation and so on, is the idea that public procurement markets must be fair market. Because it's an ethical problem, but it's not just an ethical problem. It's an economic problem. It's wasting the money of the state in other things to try saving something. And of course, this has to do with supply chains. It has to do the new term, fashionable term we have in European public procurement is resilience. And honestly, we have learned this the tough way. It's beautiful to have gloves and personal protective equipment made on the other side of the world, 12 time zone, to save a few cents. It becomes less beautiful when there is a pandemic and you don't get your personal protective equipment. So we are really starting thinking that value must consider reliability. Nicole put this very beautiful. You needed to have a reliable supply chain, not just save pennies and then land in, it's not just troubles, it was loss of life because of the, let's say, approach we had to supply chain. And this really was a waking call. Russian invasion of Ukraine was another waking call. And today we have a disruption in the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea. So we really needed to be reconsidering our our approach, and Europe is really starting focusing. We don't want to push the market down ethical standards to save money. We don't want to cause a procurement-induced race to the bottom. The standards must be high for the well-being of everyone on the planet and the planet itself. Thank you.
So one of the things that I hope you took from what Roberto was talking about, and this is actually a little bit confusing for many American readers, but you're often going to find that when the European Union and other countries talk about sustainable procurement, they're involved in a much broader conversation than we are in the United States, particularly at the federal level, where we tend to focus primarily on adapting to and mitigating climate change. In large part, that's because we were much more aggressive with social policies for many, many years. But for example, in most countries around the world, discussions of sustainability begin with the UN SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And for many of you Americans, if you're not that familiar with them, they look like, wow, quality of life type stuff. And frankly, what should matter more to governments than the kind of things that are in the UN SDGs? So just keep in mind that oftentimes we're more focused on climate change and sustainable procurement because we have minimum wage requirements in government contracts. We have prohibitions on many of the other issues, but it's all part and parcel of the larger issue. I do want to turn back to the workforce issue, and I'm going to go to Polly in just a second, but I want to take you back to one of the things that Nicole said that's so incredibly important and is easy to forget. Look, we all know in our lifetime, the acquisition workforce aged, and we know that most of our states have underinvested in the workforce. We have enough people to buy stuff. We don't focus on quality assurance after the contracts are awarded, but we've never invested in enough people. But we went through all of this effort in the 1990s, the early 2000s, to professionalize the workforce, to require certifications, to upgrade the standards. And then we turned people into clerks. We made them fill out forms and do paperwork. The term of art from just 20 years ago, these people, our procurement professionals, were going to be trusted business advisors. And then we turned them into paper pushers. But what did you hear from Nicole? Sustainable procurement, as opposed to just shopping on Amazon, is purpose-driven work. That's what the next generation wants. That's what the younger people want. If you want them to come to your organization, they're not going to come to your organization to buy stuff. They want to come work for you to change the world. They want to have impact. So I really think that as we think about these issues in terms of the acquisition workforce, yes, it's going to be hard. Yes, there's a steep learning curve. Yes, we're going to ask people about things like basic carbon literacy that the older generation never had to think about, but they want to do it. And it's going to make the jobs much more attractive to them. So against that backdrop, Polly, as the one of us who's an actual leader in the federal procurement workforce, you have people working for you that have to do this. How do you see the issues evolving? And by all means, please take an opportunity to talk a little bit more about what the aspirations are for the community of practice in NCMA.
Yeah, you bet. And I apologize. It looks like somehow I'm getting like I'm in the witness protection program. So hopefully my screen is correcting here. I just tried to change that. I want to just say that our new entrants into federal procurement absolutely are coming to us with that really critical interest and drive in meaningful work and making a difference. But I don't want us to discount the fact that there are many existing professionals in the federal acquisition community that probably cross many generations that are also in the business and the public sector because of that drive to want to make a difference and have meaningful impacts on the quality of life of those that we serve. And so I look much, broader about how we can empower those within government as we attract and grow the workforce, which to your very fair point is currently understaffed. And that has been a, consistent challenge that we continuously work to address. We've already touched upon it, but to me, leadership is the key to all of this, is how are we providing the resources and support to our acquisition community to give them the room to do this important work of reconceptualizing how we are buying in a sustainable manner the goods and services that our country and our citizens and our partners across the world deserve. A lot of what motivated me to, come outside, not just of DHS, but also my work across agencies, but to actually meaningfully bring to bear some attention to the National Contract Management Association Community of Practice is the criticality of working across the sectors to bring more attention to this space, not just working within government, but with our industry partners. And what attracted me to lead the community of practice for sustainable procurement for NCMA is that it is building bridges across our federal acquisition community, our state and local acquisition communities, industry, and our academic partners. To me, that is the sweet spot of how we can build bridges and scale what has already been learned and what we already know to work to more teams and efforts across the federal government. And so to me, there are three big goals that I have for this next phase of the community of practice that you're well read in on, but to kind of share with others to hopefully entice and motivate folks to come and partner with us through this space is if we don't talk about things, people aren't going to learn. And so, the support that NCMA provides with a committed monthly column in the Contract Management magazine, to me is part of that platform of how can we continuously make sure that people are hearing and learning and growing what they know around how to incorporate sustainability into the buying process, both as a buyer and as a supplier for the federal government. And then we talked about the competency. To me, getting sustainability competencies into our certifications and credentials is paramount, because that'll help inspire leaders to pay attention to this important piece of how we do the business of government. And then finally, it's really critical that, as we've already alluded to, people have an easy way to get access to the right information in time for them to use it. And so continuing to drive an engaged resource site that builds upon all of the work we've been sharing in our chat today, right, in one place so people can easily get it, to me is really a big piece of a service we can provide to the community. We need people to share the work you're doing, not just at the in the US, but across the globe with this community. And so, I am going to ask Jessica to put in the chat an email address. Please reach out and consider joining. I'm done my soapbox, but we really could use all the partners we can get to help, again, grow, inspire, motivate, and lead the change that's necessary here.
So, and again, as Polly mentioned, I'm pretty emotionally vested in the National Contract Management Association. I think it's the best organization for procurement professionals in the United States. I think we might be a little bit behind the curve in some of these issues. And for example, at the state level, NASPO, the National Association of State Procurement Officials, they've actually had a pretty good resource page going for a while. And that's definitely worth looking at. But to Polly's point, I think we're investing more, but we really do want to involve more people in this. So to Polly's point, if you have a good case study, share it. If you think you want to write an article for the monthly column, by all means, let us know. I do want to take just a moment. There's a number of interesting questions that have started to come in on the Q&A, but among one of the most important things to think about is people often ask about measuring success, or to the extent that we talked about value earlier, how do we measure or show that? People use the term KPIs, key performance indicators. There's a lot of different things to talk about. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges over time will be this basic carbon literacy. But I do think it is worth to pause for a moment and ask each of you how you think we show success, again, possibly on a procurement by procurement basis, maybe across an institution, maybe as a government. But I'll go ahead and start with Nicole on that.
Yeah, sure. There is so much movement within this space right now. Again, it's easy to default and say, oh, this is hard. There is so much happening within this space to pay attention to. I'll give you just a couple of examples. ProcureTech 100 is a list of the most innovative procurement technology companies globally. They identify a specific section within their annual report related to the most innovative, sustainability-oriented procurement technology companies. And this connects to the KPIs because these are the organizations that are helping helping governments, private sector companies measure and estimate and assess their carbon impacts and broader social impacts as well. I also want to call out that there's a whole suite of companies that are focused specifically on carbon assessment. So Persephone is one, giving a shout out to an Arizona-based company, Klupify out in Pennsylvania. They look at KPIs through a couple of different lenses and are helping organizations think through this a bit more systematically. They do spend-based analyses that are connected with the specific industries in which the products are produced. That is a rougher styled analysis than the product-based analysis. And we're learning as we move forward about the impacts of these goods and services, and they're helping organizations think through this. So that's on one side, that's on the carbon side. And then we have companies like TermScout, which is an AI-based contract writing company that's helping organizations embed sustainability in the contract writing process. So one KPI is the percent of contracts that are actually embedding sustainability language into the contract writing process. So there are a number of ways that organizations can approach this. Getting back to what Steve said at the beginning, don't go it alone. There's so many resources out there that are available to help organizations land to this right. We're on a pathway of learning together. So I just encourage individuals to lean in and start exploring. You're going to be surprised at how much information is already out there.
Roberto?
Well, briefly, let's say again in Europe, we are really collecting a lot of information and developing contract clauses. And these contract clauses are really go to the point of how you check compliance with a requirement. So it's not just requirement. It's a requirement and check. So that I think is a little bit the way. Again, as also Nicole was saying, do not reinvent the wheel. Of course, you can innovate, you can do new things, but first look at what is already there is huge.
Holly?
I mean, the reality is, I'm not sure how much more I would add here other, we need to work together to get this right. We need to build on the successes. It is way too complicated to start from scratch. And so resources are there. It's connecting the folks that are, in my mind, right, already underwater with what they feel they can handle in a day, with resources to make this an easier add-on, so that they start thinking about it as part of what they do every time they're in the business of buying, and not as one more thing to be adding to what they do. So changing it, I said add-on, changing it. This is not an add-on. This is embedded in how we do business. And it's going to take support to our workforces.
Yeah, I feel like it's worth taking a moment to just double back to what we were talking about earlier. And I keep coming back to this phrase, the basic carbon literacy. And I guess I just want to say another moment about, I want to take another moment to talk about what this means. So I would say around the world today, most people focus most of the discussion when we talk about the climate change issues with regard to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So to some extent, that means we need to use greenhouse gas emissions as our coin of the realm or the currency. Many of you know that the economists have been pushing carbon taxes for many years. Carbon offsets, I think many people are quite skeptical of. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is measurement of greenhouse gases. Globally, the closest thing that we have to consensus surrounds something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And it's the primary way that we describe the process for how institutions assess these three classes of their emissions: their direct emissions, scope 1, the indirect, scope 2, and then the stuff in the supply chain. So in other words, for example, if I can buy something and it looks like a more sustainable solution, but shipping it all the way around the world makes it unsustainable. I need to focus on the scope 3 as well. But herein lies the rub. As a general rule, most assessment of greenhouse gas emissions is done by the emitter. Or in other words, I self-assess, I self-disclose, I self-target. And for those of you who have followed the proposed rule in the United States, all that the responsibility rule basically says is that contractors and prospective contractors, like most companies around the world today, need to be in the business of assessing and disclosing and ultimately targeting. But let me say this, because when we talk about the point Roberta was making, we need to validate. One of the biggest problems with the greenhouse gas protocol is I do data on myself. So what we're constantly looking for is independent validators. Many people think that the best or the most credentialed independent validator today is referred to as SBTI, or the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI. There has been a tremendous amount of pushback by the American industry against SBTI because it wasn't invented in the United States. It's not ours. And in fact, I think there's a pretty significant misunderstanding that under the sustainability responsibility rule, that in effect, SBTI could deny American contractors the rights to compete. It's just not an accurate portrayal. But the point is, we do need to create some kind of independent validation mechanisms, and currently we don't have them in the United States. If we did, then we would have a consistent baseline, and it would be easier to talk about. If I pay this price premium and it reduces my scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by this, is it worth paying that price premium? So that's a key part of that. But again, these are massive issues. Did you want to weigh in on this a little bit, Nicole?
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head. And related to the SBTI, what we're just really talking about is standardization, because there are a lot of different ways to measure this. Now, again, I say don't let perfect get in the way of good. You should still do it in the absence of having a widely accepted standard. But related to SBTI, this organization's been around for a while. It has enormous street cred within the industry and globally. I pause and I ask, why should we reinvent something that's already being done very, very well in another space? I think it is a mechanism, the controversy that you alluded to, it's a mechanism to slow progress and nothing more.
So I think one of the other things that's really important to keep in mind on this is, let's just put yourself in the shoes of the procurement professional that wants to do this, right? What many American procurement professionals forget today is just a generation ago, into the mid-1990s, we had a mandatory evaluation factor that you were supposed to take into account the environmental impact of your procurement, just like past performance, just like price, just like quality. Well, I think that in the future, we may very likely see that, but to Polly's point, you can do that today. You can craft an evaluation factor that says you are going to consider the life cycle cost, the total cost of ownership, or the benefits or the harm of the solution. Now, to Nicole's point, we may not be yet able to standardize exactly what the proposals say and what the promises are, but we should at least be getting the information so that we can think about it and attempt to make the comparisons and the trade-offs. Now, as is often the case, when you have a group of experts like this, lots of great information. We could do this all day, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. But I did promise each of the panelists that before I stop talking at the end of the day, I would give each of them the opportunity to give a closing word or at least one takeaway before we wrap up today. So I think I'm going to go in reverse order, although I've probably forgotten my order at this point. And I'm going to start with Polly. So closing thoughts, takeaways, what do you want people to remember from today?
Mine will be pretty brief here, Steve. Nothing changes if nothing changes. That is my mantra for 2024. Every year I pick one. That's mine for 2024. So I'd like you to consider adopting it with me. And what that means for me in this discussion is we've done a lot of talking. We know this is an important objective and societal good, right? To think and incorporate sustainability into the business of buying for the US federal government. Please give it a try. If you're a leader, give your team space, encourage and motivate and support them to get after this. If you're a requirements owner, build this into your requirements. If you're a procurement professional, ask the team how you can get after this and give it a try. Don't start from scratch. Don't work in the void. Nicole's already addressed that very well for all of us. Use the resources and tools. Hell, come to the Sustainable Procurement Community of Practice and we'll guide you. But bring this to light. Let's go beyond words and try. We're not going to get it perfect the first time. Perfect is the enemy of good. And we're gonna learn as we go and then scale. So please, that's to me. Nothing changes if nothing changes. Let's get after this year. Thanks, Steve.
Roberto.
Well, I would say that any procurer can be Wonder Woman or Superman or anything and really change our world for the better. Of course, we can give some help. The approach in Europe is making this kind of mandatory, have a baseline. You don't go lower than this. You can go higher than this. This is probably easier in Europe. Jason Czarneski, PhD, but also from Pace University. Well, he wrote his comparison of US and EU and said, oh, but the EU is more centralized in public procurement than the US. Yes, the EU is more centralized, meaning that now that there is the Green Deal, the drive to use public procurement as a policy tool, well, you can be Wonder Woman, but you must do at least walking the line. Thank you a lot for this super interesting conversation we had today.
Nicole.
Yeah, I just want to begin by thank you for this incredible opportunity. It has just been a real pleasure sharing this time and space with you all, such expertise ahead of us. What I want my takeaway to be is that change is imperative and we don't have time to delay. So some taglines: don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Don't go it alone. A couple of resources that are out there that we haven't mentioned to date is the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, which is helping organizations drive change, the Responsible Purchasing Network. There are many. And then finally, the business case for this, it's incredible. And so not doing it is a tremendous lost opportunity to add value to your organization. So let's make it happen.
So I'm all in on nothing changes if nothing changes. And any of my students will always tell you that I've been a big fan of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But I just want to come back to the theme you heard from each of our panelists, that the bottom line is this is going to require change and it's going to be hard. But look, we all know that none of us learn new things overnight. None of us dramatically change the way we think or act overnight. This is all about incremental progress, but we need a lot of it and we need a lot of it soon. So every procurement, Roberto says, all hands on deck. Every procurement, think about how it can be a little bit less harmful or a little bit better. But to Polly's point, as you start to get involved here, think about reading and learning and taking advantage of what everybody else is already doing here. I mean, I am constantly reiterating the catchphrase from Catherine Hayhoe's wonderful book, Saving Us. The most important thing any of us can do with regard to climate change is talk about it. And if we're talking about these issues and convincing other people to join us on the journey, I think we're going in the right direction. I cannot thank the panelists enough, not just for their time today and their willingness to engage, but for all of the work that has gotten them to the point that made them the kind of people we wanted to include in this discussion. So thank you for being here today, and thank you for everything that you do. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you for joining us. Spread the word, talk about it, and we look forward to hearing from you if there are more things we should be thinking about or learning or you'd like to hear from us in the future. Let me again also thank my wonderful colleague, Jessica Tillotman, for making this a reality. And again, thanks to everybody. Thanks for joining us.